You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. The border has remained a big talking point for the coming election. But for so many Americans, it's really the border as abstraction, border as fantasy, border as threat. The very same place, a 1,400-mile line between two big countries, is a vastly different place when it's described by Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Mexico is a major American trading partner, home to the world's 14th biggest economy, a top destination for American travelers, and home to more than 1.5 million American citizens. But look over the last 200 years of the relationship, and the two countries have had a lot of grief and struggle. Wars, land grabs, and lately, critically, refugee flows. And that's where the curious relationship between Mexico's recently departed president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and presidential hopeful former president Donald Trump comes in, and where Eduardo Porter joins us, columnist and editorial board member for the Washington Post. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Oh, hey, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
There were rumors in the final year of AMLO's presidency that he wanted Donald Trump to win, and that Mexico could do things to help make that happen. Let's take those things one at a time. Why would a Mexican nationalist like Andrés Manuel López Obrador want a man so outwardly hostile to Mexico and Mexicans to win?
Yeah, this is pretty weird, isn't it? The ideological inclinations of these two men are very different. Trump comes from the very right end of American politics, whereas Mr. López Obrador sees himself as a champion of the left. But still, I think there's a couple of things going on. Their personal characters were somewhat similar. They shared this kind of like transactional approach to life and dealing and diplomacy. You give me that, and I'll give you this, and I'll lay off of other things. So, the fact that Trump was really only interested in migrants and trade and didn't much care about democracy in Mexico or other issues of Mexican governance was actually very welcome by López Obrador, who, kind of like is very, very mistrustful of what he sees as a tendency amongst Democrats to meddle a bit more, to be worried about things like the militarization of the state or the state of Mexican democracy and things like that. And so that kind of like pushed him towards Trump's direction.
In their system, the Mexican president is a pretty powerful person. What were his levers? The things he could do to make that rumor, that story running through the Mexican chattering classes, even heard here in Washington, plausible? What made him believe he could do things to influence an American election and throw it toward the Republicans?
Well, it was coincidence. He was given the gift of hundreds of thousands of migrants moving through his territory, seeking the United States, seeking asylum in the United States. And, the fact that he suddenly thought, oh, wow, there's this very, very politically powerful force right here that I have the valve over. I can, more or less turn it on and turn it off by deploying the Mexican National Guard or not deploying the Mexican National Guard to stop migrants on their way north. So he had a tool that none of his predecessors had to influence U.S. politics, because this is a very, very explosive issue, as you know, in the United States.
And to remind our listeners, these were not Mexicans heading north. It was Cubans, Venezuelans, West Africans, Ukrainians, Chinese, all kinds of people crossing Mexico to head to the southern border of the United States. So you're saying that gave him a kind of power?
Well, yeah. We first saw this in an open deal with President Trump, when Trump first said, look, you either stop migrants from getting here, or I'm going to slap some really harsh tariffs on Mexico, on Mexican exports to the United States. And so that was a very overt kind of like, okay, let's make a deal here. and Mexico suddenly devoted a whole bunch of resources. I think that's when the National Guard was first really deployed at Mexico's southern border to keep migrants moving up through Mexico towards the United States. Then Trump leaves office, and of course, Biden doesn't want to be Trump too. He's got a different way of governing, and so he's not threatening Mexico. But AMLO, Lopez Obrador, still has the tool. The tool is still in Mexico's turf. So he could basically turn migration on and off. And we saw this very, very starkly last December when suddenly the migration authority in Mexico supposedly ran out of money. And there was a huge surge of migrants moving to the US border and reaching the US border. I think it was the biggest number of encounters of migrants with Border Patrol agents on record in December of 2023. So Biden sent Anthony Blinken and Alejandro Mayorkas to Mexico City to guys, help, please. And suddenly the Migration Authority found the resources, the National Guard was redeployed, and the number of encounters with migrants at the US border by Border Patrol agents plummeted. So it's been very, very low from January, at least through August, because of the efforts of Mexicans that basically when migrants move up Mexico, they'll be intercepted at some point by usually the National Guard, and then they'll be put on a bus back to the south of Mexico. And so these guys are set on what's known here as a carousel of migrants. They'll arrive to some northern city, they're put in a bus, sent down to a southern city, they start again. And the idea is, wearing these poor people out, because this is not an easy trek. And these folks are in often quite desperate circumstances. But anyway, that's how it's been managed in the last several months.
But it sounded then like the Mexican president who was getting the deference, the respect, the recognition of who needs who in this relationship. If you've got the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Secretary of State, one of the heaviest hitters in any presidential administration, coming to your capital to ask for your help, after all, wasn't AMLO getting what he wanted at that point?
Well, yes. And in fact, what he also was getting was the Americans kind of laying off. The Biden administration basically had no criticism of anything that Mexico did. And that included things like some energy policies that are arguably in violation of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. There was a prohibition on the importation of corn and of glyphosate, a pesticide that was also likely in violation of the trade deal. And those things were never really fully pursued by the U.S., which I think in normal circumstances would have pursued these deals because there are powerful lobbies in the U.S. pushing the government to pursue them. But because it really didn't want to anger the Mexicans, it just let them go away. And on other issues, such as commenting on the increasing militarization of governance in Mexico, which is something that the U.S. would normally do or has done often in the history of the relationship, that was really not touched until very, very recently, kind of almost on the eve of a judicial reform that is going to basically totally remake the Mexican judiciary in very worrying ways. The U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Salazar, actually made some very, very mild criticism, expressing U.S. concerns super mildly. And the Mexican president really lashed back pretty harshly, supposedly putting the relationship with the U.S. embassy on suspension. I don't know what that means, but that's what he said he was going to do. He was going to somehow put a pause on relations with the U.S. embassy. So anyhow, this gave Mexico the power to just keep the U.S. at bay on any issue that Mexico cared about. And so I think that in itself was, valuable to Mexico, to the Mexican president.
As the Lopez Obrador presidency was entering its final year, so was the Joe Biden presidency, with one key difference. At the time, President Biden was still running for re-election, and Lopez Obrador was going to leave the stage because Mexican presidents can't succeed themselves. Did that make an important difference for where the two men found themselves during the very political year of 2024?
The fact that elections were happening in both countries, I think, is important because it made the issue of migration that much more important. In the United States, interestingly, it does not have enormous political salience in Mexico. I don't think Lopez Obrador's popularity was in any way affected by policies regarding migrants. But yeah, because there was an election in the US, suddenly Mexico has this valuable tool. I'm not sure to what extent the Mexican election shaped the use of this tool, shaped the Mexican policy towards migration and towards the United States. My feeling, I mean, the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has only been in office a few days, so it's hard really to tell. But it seems to me that she is a more pragmatic politician that will be more at ease dealing with the United States across a variety of things, including migration and energy and so forth. And so this kind of like very somewhat belligerent attitude that colored Lopez Obrador's policies and approaches to the United States quite often is not likely going to be as present. So, yes, I do think that the new Mexican government will probably have a better relationship, a more kind of like steady day-to-day relationship with the United States. Well, if Kamala Harris is the US president, if Donald Trump is the US president, it becomes very, very hard to predict what the relationship is going to be, because he's been calling like to send special forces to Mexico, missiles, deport millions of people, that kind of crazy stuff will probably make the relationship very difficult.
We've been discussing the relationship between Lopez Obrador and Donald Trump. What about the rank and file Mexicans? Is it a similar thing with them? Do they approve of Donald Trump's renegade outsider status? Or do Mexicans favor Democrats? I mean, when they look at the election season in the Colossus to the north, and I know it's covered heavily on television, I know it's covered in the newspapers, what do they see?
I mean, for sure, it's super important. It might be even more important than the Mexican election. No, I'm kidding. But the US election is of paramount importance to Mexicans, and they do pay attention. It's massively covered on Mexican TV. But just to answer the question, Mexicans do prefer Democrats. I mean, according to polls in Mexican media, at least since about 2004, Mexicans have preferred the Democratic candidate to the presidency by a substantial margin. And that's still true today. I think the last poll I saw was like a 2/3 to 1/5 with the balance undecided, supporting Harris over Trump. People aren't going to love you that much if you're talking about bombing their country, right? So, it's not crazy that Trump would not be perceived with enormous love here. And yet, interestingly, I mean, here's an interesting fact that I'm not sure I quite understand. Perceptions of the United States-Mexico relationship in Mexico improved a lot during the Trump administration. And I don't know if it's part of, well, maybe the economy was doing well, the US economy was doing well. For all the Trumpian rhetoric, the problem with migration wasn't really about Mexicans. It was Central Americans at the time that were being like put in cages and kept from coming into the United States. And so maybe the bad things emanating from Trump weren't seen as affecting Mexico so much. But yeah, there's this poll by El Financiero newspaper that shows a pretty significant improvement in the perception of the U.S. throughout his administration.
Among those same Mexicans, just regular on-the-street Mexicans, is there ambivalence, hostility, affinity? Earlier, you mentioned Mexicans have experience in the United States, have relatives living in the United States. A huge number have worked there, gone north to earn some money and then come back home. But it goes further than that. They drive American pickup trucks, they watch American movies and TV shows, they drink American soft drinks and shop at American-based big-box retailers. For the many historical reasons there might be for resentment, is there affection as well?
Oh, I think there's a lot of affection. I think it's an interesting split because the political class, the government, and mostly on the left-leaning side of the ideological spectrum, you will find a lot of hostility towards the United States based on the nature of the historic relationship, right? This notion that the U.S. is a bully, an imperialist that, steps over everybody to get what it wants. That is very alive and well in the ruling party now, for instance, in the Morena party, which comes from the Mexican left. But amongst Mexicans, I think Mexicans mostly like the United States and like Americans. I mean, again, you see this in polls, and they have pretty warm feelings for the United States. And I'm guessing it's not only that they have this personal experiences of living there and working there, and their kids going to school there and stuff like that, but also because of all the cultural exports from the U.S. that are consumed in Mexico.
We're still just days into the Claudia Sheinbaum administration. She'll be at Los Pinos, the Mexican White House, for another 6 years. But we don't know that much about her feelings toward the United States, do we?
Well, let me just first correct you. She's not going to be governing from Los Pinos. AMLO opened Los Pinos to the public. He said he would not live there, opened it to the public, and he now lives at Palacio Nacional in the very center of the city. It's a very popular move. There's a couple of questions here. Will Claudia govern as her own woman with an independent policy platform from her predecessor, Mr. López Obrador? Or, as many people fear, will she act more like a puppet of the very, very powerful president that preceded her? And there's reason to suspect that she might have kind of like a very constrained space for maneuver, because a lot of the people in key positions in the party and in the cabinet are actually Mr. López Obrador's people. She does not really have a very strong base of alliances of her own, a political base that would allow her to maybe break away. So the question is, well, is this going to be an AMLO 2 government, or is Claudia really going to move in a different direction? And then the second question is, well, to what extent, even if she could, would she move in a different direction? And what I would guess, this is still yet a guess, that in things like energy policy, she will break away from the past administration. I also think that on security, which was pretty much a disaster during the López Obrador administration, she will likely want to take some steps of her own. There's this perception that Mexico City, which she governed until she became president, was more successful than the rest of the country at controlling crime. And a lot of that was through better policing techniques, and a lot of that was done in coordination with U.S. agencies. But anyhow, those are questions that I have about what this government's going to look like.
To the degree that Mexico and Mexicans are an issue in this presidential election at all, it has to do with the cartels. There's a lot of attention on both the tempo and lethality of cartel conflict inside Mexico that's accompanied the arrival of Claudia Sheinbaum to the president's office, and the transshipment of Chinese-made components for fentanyl and their interdiction at the border, the arrival of opiates and other drugs that are transshipped through Mexico. Does Mexico still have a kind of gravitational pull on American politics, even now with just a couple of weeks left?
Oh, yeah. I mean, drugs and migration, Mexico is right in the center of those two issues that are of primary importance to American voters. So, yes, I mean, the problem that you mentioned of narco trafficking, it goes back like to Nixon, right? I mean, this has been an unsolved problem for decades and decades and decades. I mean, right now, it's particularly violent. I would say that what are the salient differences now? It's particularly violent. And the new drug of choice is particularly lethal in the United States. So those two things make it perhaps more salient than it was even at the height of the crack epidemic. But it's a same old problem in a way. And it's a problem that will not be solved by either of these countries individually. I think it requires a lot of cooperation. It requires much more conversation about how the Mexican problem, which is violence and the weakening of the state, is different from the U.S. problem, which is drug abuse and drug trading. And these problems are not identical, and they require different approaches. And I don't think there's really ever been a good understanding, okay, what do we need to solve both our problems, and how can we make these two things cooperate? So I'm not very optimistic about the security situation, frankly, or the narco trafficking situation. But I do think, I mean, so just the fact that both Harris and Sheinbaum seem to be kind of like reasonable people that might be able to sit down at the table and try to hammer something out, that's a little better than the current situation where there's just nothing but mistrust between Mexican and U.S. authorities on organized crime and drug trafficking.
So if Kamala Harris wins it, it sounds like you think there's the possibility for a reset, even though she was part of the previous administration.
Yeah, I mean, reset is a really big word, maybe reset-ish, a little reset. I think there's an opportunity to broaden the conversation, because the conversation right now was only, look, deal with the migrants for me. I mean, from the U.S. to Mexico, deal with the migrants, and I won't bug you on anything else. AMLO, which at the beginning was a little bit wavering early in the Biden administration, was not as helpful. He has now, since this year, been very, very helpful to Biden in that respect. But I think the relationship has suffered because no other issue has actually been addressed. Issues of trade, issues of investment, issues of, crime prevention, drug trafficking, democracy, militarization, a variety of things that I think should be discussed in the bilateral relationship have just not been there.
And finally, Eduardo, if Trump wins?
Gosh. I mean, that's the most unpredictable situation, right? I mean, first, let's say he does what he says he's going to do. I mean, I don't just one item on his agenda, which is deporting all undocumented immigrants, which the Department of Homeland Security estimates at about 11 million people, although Trump has been throwing out much bigger numbers than that, is just a feat that I don't think the U.S. has ever accomplished anything at this scale, even when it got extremely xenophobic. In the Eisenhower administration, it managed to get rid of 1 million immigrants. And in fact, in the mix, there was a lot of U.S. citizens in there because they would just kick out everybody that sort of looked Mexican, And I mean, I can imagine how this will disrupt the U.S. and how this will disrupt the U.S.-Mexico relationship is just something that I can't really kind of put a number to. It just sounds terrible. And things like sending special forces into Mexico unilaterally, or even sending armed drones and stuff. I mean, that strikes me as beyond the pale and kind of beyond any sort of reasonable analysis. It's but my guess is that what Mexico would strive for in the case of a Trump administration is sort of like an equilibrium like the one López Obrador had with Trump the first time around. Let's see if there's a deal to be had. We know you like deals. Can we cut a deal that works somewhat for us? Whether that deal is there, I don't know, but that's, I think, going to be the effort.
Eduardo Porter is a writer and columnist for the Washington Post. His latest book is American Poison: How Racial Hostility Destroyed Our Promise. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Well, thank you so much. It was fun.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Mateo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.